His name was Elijah, a lean man with a fiery gaze, hailing from Tishbe in the rugged highlands of Gilead. He had no noble ancestry, no priestly lineage, no scrolls to his name, and no official position in the temple. Yet, Elijah would rise to become one of the most powerful and feared prophets in the entire history of Israel. This is the story of Elijah, the man who defied kings, called down fire from the heavens, and spoke face to face with God when an entire nation had forgotten his name. Before we dive deep into his incredible journey, if you want to ensure you don't miss powerful stories like this, take a moment to subscribe and click the bell. It truly helps these narratives reach more people. Israel was shrouded in a time of deep spiritual darkness. King Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned from Samaria, and his rule was not merely weak, but wicked. To cement his power, he had taken a wife, Jezebel, a princess from Sidon. She was a foreign woman who brought with her the worship of Baal, the Canaanite god of storms, fertility, and bloody rituals. Under her sway, Ahab constructed temples and altars to Baal throughout the kingdom. Sacrifices were made, not just of animals, but even of children. The true prophets of the Lord were hunted down, and many were brutally murdered. The land once consecrated to the God of Abraham was now thoroughly infested with idolatry. The people could no longer tell the difference between the Creator and the idols carved by human hands. The laws of the Lord were disregarded, and the name Yahweh was a forgotten word on the lips of the nation. In this grim setting, when all seemed utterly lost, God raised up a man. Elijah appeared suddenly before Ahab's throne. There was no announcement, no procession, no royal escort, no ceremony. Just a solitary man, clad in a coarse mantle, his feet dusty from the roads of Gilead, but carrying an authority that did not come from any mortal king. He looked the king dead in the eye and pronounced a sentence that would shake the entire nation to its core. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. Oh, with those few potent words, Elijah didn't just declare a drought. He declared a direct judgment on the very heart of their idolatry. Baal, the supposed god of rain, would be silenced by the one true God. The drought would serve as undeniable proof that the Lord alone still controlled the heavens. Elijah then departed from the court as he had arrived, without permission and without fear. Immediately the Lord spoke to him, commanding him to go into hiding. He led him to the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan River. There, in complete isolation, God promised to sustain him. Every single day, ravens brought him bread in the morning and meat in the evening. He drank from the brook and lived far from the chaos consuming the kingdom. While Israel began to feel the first brutal effects of the drought, parched lands, failing crops, and dry wells, God's prophet was living under divine care. In the silence of Kerith, Elijah was learning obedience, patience, and total dependence on his Lord. This is how his story truly began, not with human glory or popularity, but with courage, isolation, and unwavering faithfulness. Elijah, the man with no rank, no title, and no fear, had just declared spiritual war on the corrupt system destroying Israel. A single man, with the word of God on his tongue, had stopped the sky. And this was only the beginning. Elijah, the solitary prophet from Tishbe, remained hidden in obedience by the Kerith ravine. The water still trickled between the stones, clear and cool, and the ravens arrived like a divine clock, delivering bread in the morning and meat in the afternoon. It was a strange routine, to be sure, but it was God's provision. In the solitude of the desert, Elijah had no human company, no news from the kingdom, only the whisper of the wind, the rustle of dry bushes, and the certainty that he was exactly where the Lord wanted him to be. As the days rolled by, while Elijah was being secretly strengthened, judgment began to lash Israel. The rain had completely stopped. The sky remained sealed, with not a single cloud on the horizon. First came the dust, then the oppressive heat, and then the gnawing hunger. The fields turned barren, and the livestock perished beside dried-up riverbeds. Baal, the so-called god of fertility, remained silent. His pagan priests offered up prayers and performed sacrifices, but not a single drop of rain fell from the sky. A bewildered Ahab was beginning to grasp that Elijah's word had not been an empty threat. Jezebel, seething with fury, intensified her persecution of the Lord's prophets. Many more were murdered, while others were forced to flee or go into hiding. But Elijah, far from the palace, lived in peace. It wasn't the peace of comfort, but the peace that comes from knowing you are in God's will. But then the brook began to shrink. Every day its level dropped. The murmur of the water grew fainter, until one day it dried up completely. There was no more current, no more moisture, no more sustenance. The place of refuge had become a place of testing. Elijah knew that God had not forgotten him, but he was learning that obedience doesn't always lead to immediate security. Still, he waited, and then the voice of the Lord came to him once more. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon, and stay there. I have commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food. The command was perplexing. Zarephath wasn't in Israel. It was in foreign territory, Phoenicia, the very land from which Jezebel herself had come. But Elijah didn't hesitate. He got up and began his journey. It was a long trek, with his bare feet on the scorching dust under a relentless sun, but he was filled with purpose. The word of God continued to guide him step by step. When he arrived at the outskirts of Zarephath, he found a woman gathering sticks. She was thin, her face etched with the marks of hunger. Elijah looked at her and said, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" As she went to get it, he added, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." The woman stopped, her voice trembling. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Elijah looked at her with compassion, but also with firmness. He knew God had orchestrated this very encounter. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. If you find this level of faith incredible, show some love by hitting that like button." The woman looked at Elijah, her eyes filled with doubt, but also with a strange glimmer of hope. She was a widow, a foreigner, and the mother of a child who barely had the strength to walk. Hunger had weakened them, the drought had surrounded them, and death seemed like the only open door. Yet the promise of this stranger sounded different. He wasn't asking for charity. He was speaking in the name of the God of Israel, a God she barely knew. She obeyed. She went into her small mud brick house, lit a fire with the sticks she had gathered, and mixed the last of her flour with a few drops of oil. She baked a small cake and handed it to Elijah. She didn't know if this would be her last act on earth, but she did it. Elijah ate calmly. Then the woman prepared another cake for herself and her son. She didn't understand how, but when she looked at the jar and the jug, they both contained the same amount as before. The flour had not diminished, and the oil had not run out. It was a quiet miracle, but a steady one. A daily, real miracle. And so it went. From that day on, every morning she awoke to find just enough flour and the perfect amount of oil. There was never an excess, but there was never a lack. Elijah lived with her and her son for many days. They ate together, shared chores, and the prophet spoke of the living God who had shut the heavens and was now sustaining a foreign household in the midst of a famine. The woman listened, and she learned. She didn't know all the laws of Israel or understand all the ways of this God who spoke through prophets. But every day that her son ate was a living lesson. She no longer gathered sticks for her last meal, but for the continuous provision of a God who sees the humble and sustains the forgotten. However, their trial was not over. After some time, the woman's son fell ill. At first, it was a fever, then weakness, until he stopped breathing. The little boy died in his mother's arms, and the grief that had temporarily left her returned with a vengeance. She cried out, she wept, and she looked at Elijah with eyes full of suffering and accusation. "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Elijah didn't respond with human words. He took the child from her arms, carried him up to the room where he was staying, and laid him on his own bed. Then he cried out to the Lord with pain, with intensity, with tears. "Oh Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" He stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out again, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." And then the impossible happened. The Lord heard Elijah's voice. The boy's soul returned to his body, and he lived. The prophet came down the stairs carrying the child and presented him alive to his mother. "Look, your son is alive." The woman embraced him in astonishment, her eyes no longer showing any doubt. "Now I know that you are a man of God," she declared, "and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." The widow who had prepared her last meal to die now believed in the God who gives life. And Elijah, the hidden prophet, continued to be refined in faith, in obedience, and in purpose. The days turned into months, and the months turned into years. The drought did not let up. The fields of Israel were a cracked desert. The pastures were dead. Hunger was no longer just suffering. It was death. The cities were filled with laments, and the clans cried out without receiving any answer. The priests of Baal multiplied their rituals, cutting themselves, chanting until they were exhausted. But the sky remained sealed. Baal, the god of rain, was silent. In this context of absolute desperation, the word of the Lord came to Elijah once more. "Go, present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land." Elijah, strengthened by the trials he had endured, descended from Zarephath and set out for the kingdom of Israel. He went with no army and no escort. He carried no sword and no banners. He simply walked with the certainty that he spoke for the living God. 3.5 years had passed since he went into hiding. 3.5 years of judgment upon the nation. Meanwhile, Ahab was frantic. He had sent messengers to all the neighboring nations in search of Elijah, convinced that he was to blame for the drought. But the prophet was nowhere to be found, and the water grew scarcer with each passing day. The king himself even went out in search of pasture, accompanied by his palace administrator Obadiah, a man who feared the Lord and had secretly hidden 100 faithful prophets in caves, sustaining them with bread and water. It was on one of these journeys that Obadiah met Elijah on the road. He recognized him instantly and fell prostrate before him. "Is it really you, my lord Elijah?" "It is," he replied. "Go, tell your master, Elijah is here." Obadiah shuddered. "What have I done wrong, that you are handing your servant over to Ahab to be killed? There is not a nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you. And now you tell me to go and say that you are here. What if the Spirit of the Lord carries you off to some other place, and when he can't find you, he kills me?" But Elijah answered with firmness, "As the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to him today." Obadiah obeyed. He went before the king and announced the prophet's presence. Ahab, without delay, went to meet him. When he saw him, he confronted him with rage. "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" But Elijah did not back down. His voice was steady, his spirit filled with divine authority. "I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now, summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." It was a direct challenge, a spiritual duel on the summit of Carmel. This wasn't just a clash between men, it was a battle between gods, between the God of Israel and the idols of stone. Elijah, a single prophet against hundreds of false priests, a mountain as the stage, an entire nation as the witness. Ahab, pressured by desperation, agreed. He ordered the summons. The tribes of Israel began to move, climbing Mount Carmel with anticipation. The prophets of Baal prepared with arrogance. Elijah, in silence, walked toward the place of judgment. The moment had arrived. The climax of years of drought, idolatry, and deception was about to begin. The sun climbed over Mount Carmel, illuminating an imposing scene. The people of Israel were gathered on the summit, looking on with uncertainty at what was about to unfold. On one side, the 450 prophets of Baal stood in formation, adorned in their ceremonial robes. Beside them were the 400 prophets of Asherah, servants of Jezebel's pagan cult. On the other side stood a single figure, Elijah, in his simple tunic, his face weathered by the years of drought, but his gaze burning with faith. Elijah took a step forward and spoke to the people, his voice rising with firmness, echoing among the rocks and trees of Carmel. "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him." But no one answered. The silence was absolute. The people were afraid of choosing wrongly. Their spiritual confusion was that deep. What do you think of this moment? Was the people's silence out of fear or genuine confusion? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Elijah then proposed a challenge, clear, simple, and inescapable. "Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he who is God." The people agreed. This seemed fair to them. Elijah gave the first turn to the prophets of Baal. They took their bull, prepared it on the altar, and began to call on the name of Baal. From morning until noon they shouted, "Baal, answer us!" They danced, they screamed, they worked themselves into a frenzy. But there was no voice, no one to answer, no one to listen. The altar remained untouched. The fire did not descend. The sky was mute. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." Growing desperate, the prophets began to slash themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed freely. The frenzy turned to screaming. The pleas turned to chaos, but there was no response. The afternoon passed, and the altar remained cold. Then Elijah called to the people, "Come here to me," and they all drew near. With calm deliberation, Elijah repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, reminding them of their spiritual unity under God's covenant. With these stones, he built a new altar. He dug a trench around it, arranged the wood, and prepared the bull on top. But he didn't stop there. "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood," he commanded. They did it, and Elijah repeated, "Do it again." And they did it again, and once more, "Do it a 3rd time." And they repeated it. The water ran down all over the altar and even filled the trench. It was completely soaked. There was no possibility of the fire starting by accident or by some human trick. When the time came for the evening sacrifice, Elijah approached the altar and prayed, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts Bethriac again." And then it happened. Fire fell from heaven. It consumed the offering, the wood, the stones, the soil, and even licked up the water in the trench. It was a pure, divine, unmistakable fire. The people fell on their faces and cried out, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" Mount Carmel trembled, not from an earthquake, but from the spiritual shock that had just occurred. The heavenly fire that descended in response to Elijah's prayer didn't just consume the sacrifice. It also burned away every last doubt in the hearts of the people. There was no longer silence or hesitation. The kneeling crowd shouted in unison, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" At long last, after years of idolatry, the heart of Israel was breaking. The spiritual eyes of the nation were beginning to open. Elijah, still standing by the smoldering altar, did not celebrate with joy, but with solemnity. He knew there was still a task to complete, to eradicate the evil that had plunged the kingdom into darkness. He turned to the people and proclaimed with a firm voice, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let a single one get away." The people, stirred by the divine manifestation, obeyed. One by one, the prophets were captured, their robes torn by determined hands. There was no escape. Elijah led them down to the Kishon Valley at the foot of the mountain, and there they were executed. It was God's judgment against years of religious corruption, of deception, of the innocent blood shed by Jezebel's orders. Elijah wasn't acting out of revenge, but as an instrument of divine justice. The people had wavered for too long. Now the Lord was restoring His holiness. The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't the silence of doubt, but of reflection. The waters of the stream carried away the remains of a pagan system that had been unmasked. Elijah once again climbed the mountain, but this time it was not to issue a challenge, but to intercede. The work was not yet finished. Israel had been shaken, but the drought continued. Elijah said to Ahab, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." Ahab, still stunned by what he had witnessed, returned to his camp, but Elijah did not go with him. The prophet climbed even higher on the mountain. prostrated himself on the ground, and put his face between his knees. It was a posture of humility, of supplication. Elijah prayed not for fire this time, but for water, not for judgment, but for mercy. He called to his servant, "Go and look toward the sea." The servant obeyed. He looked toward the horizon to the west, where the Mediterranean Sea used to announce the arrival of rain. But he saw nothing. "There is nothing there," he said. Elijah did not move. He prayed again. He sent his servant again, and again, and again. 7 times he repeated the action. 7 times he persisted. There was no impatience, only a faith that does not depend on what is seen, but on what is believed. On the 7th time, the servant exclaimed, "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." It was tiny, insignificant to the natural eye, but for Elijah it was enough. He stood up and said, "Go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." And as he spoke, the sky grew dark, the clouds gathered, the wind began to blow, and the long-awaited rain fell with force upon the thirsty land. The judgment was over. The restoration was beginning. The drought, a symbol of the people's spiritual dryness, was giving way to the dew of reconciliation. Israel had seen the true God. They had witnessed his power and his grace, and Elijah, faithful to the end, had become the instrument of that change. The rain beat down hard on the parched fields of Israel, and the land, after 3.5 years of drought, began to breathe again. But while the drops fell like a blessing upon the people, a new storm was brewing over Elijah's heart. This time, it wasn't from the sky, but from the hardened heart of one woman. Jezebel, the queen, upon learning of the judgment on her prophets of Baal, did not break. She did not tremble before the fire of God, nor did she surrender to his power. Instead, she sent a message dripping with fury and threat. "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Elijah, the man who had challenged a king, who had called down fire from heaven, was now afraid. He was human. Jezebel's threat pierced his exhausted soul. After the spiritual battle, the confrontation with the people, the constant pressure, the prophet felt broken, and he fled. From Jezreel, he ran south, crossing the kingdom of Judah until he reached Beersheba. There, he left his servant and continued on, alone, into the desert. His steps were heavy, his heart troubled. He no longer felt strong. This was not the same man who had faced down hundreds of false prophets. In the desert, there was no fire, no rain, no crowds, only sand, silence, and the crushing weight of his inner burden. He walked for a full day until, exhausted, he sat down under a broom tree. There, in absolute solitude, the prophet prayed. But this time, it was not to display God's power. He prayed from a place of hopelessness. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." He wasn't asking for fire. He wasn't asking for miracles. He was only asking for the end. Elijah, like so many before and after him, felt he had failed, that his mission hadn't changed the world, that his efforts had been in vain. It was a broken prayer from a man at his limit. If you've ever felt this way, know you're not alone. Consider sharing this video with someone who might need a reminder that even the strongest among us have moments of weakness. Then he fell asleep under that bush, overcome by exhaustion and pain. But God did not abandon him. He didn't respond with reproach, but with tenderness. An angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." Elijah opened his eyes. Before him was a cake of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. A second time, The angel returned, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." It wasn't a command. It was silent care. God didn't shout, didn't reprimand, didn't demand. He simply fed him, like a mother tending to her weak child. Elijah ate, and strengthened by that heavenly food, he traveled for 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There, he took shelter in a cave. It was the same mountain where Moses had encountered the Almighty. Now, Elijah was seeking answers, direction, perhaps a reason to go on. The story was not over, even though he thought it was. God was watching him. He had not forgotten him. The silence of the desert wasn't abandonment. It was preparation. Elijah didn't know it, but in that desolate place, on the verge of giving up, he was on the threshold of one of the most profound revelations of his life. The voice of the Lord was about to be heard, not in fire or in a storm, but in the unseen. The cave on Horeb was cold and dark, but no more so than Elijah's own heart. There, among the rock shadows, the prophet waited, not for instructions, but perhaps for a sign that his life still had a purpose. He had done everything he knew how to do. He had confronted kings, challenged idols, called down fire, prayed for rain, and fled to the desert. And now, here he was, alone. Then the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It was a profound question, not meant to gather information, but to provoke reflection. God didn't need the answer. Elijah did. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty," he replied. "The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." It was the cry of a weary soul, convinced he was utterly alone, convinced that all his efforts had been useless. Then God told him, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord." Elijah obeyed. He approached the entrance of the cave. A powerful wind began to blow, so strong that it shattered the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake that shook the ground. The stones trembled beneath his feet, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a blazing fire that lit up the sky. The flames danced as they had on Carmel, but the Lord was not in the fire. And then, after all of that, came a gentle and quiet whisper, and there was God. Not in the thunderous noise, not in the spectacular display, not in the terrifying power, but in the soft, in the serene, in the unseen. When Elijah heard it, he covered his face with his cloak and went out. He knew he was in the presence of the Almighty. Once more God's voice asked, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah repeated his lament, word for word. His pain had not changed, but this time, God's response was not fire or wind, but a plan. "Go back the way you came," the Lord said, "and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also, anoint Jehu king over Israel, and anoint Elisha son of Shaphat to succeed you as prophet." God was not only restoring his purpose, he was showing him that the mission was not over. There was more to do, more to prepare, more to leave in the hands of others. And then he added something that would shatter his soul's loneliness. "Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him." Elijah was not alone. He had never been alone. He just couldn't see the others. While he was fighting in the visible realm, God was working in the invisible. 7,000 faithful, silent but steadfast, were proof that the kingdom was not lost. If you're enjoying these deeper explorations of faith and history, consider joining our community at True Light by subscribing. We have so much more to uncover together. Elijah understood then that God's work doesn't always manifest in grand spectacles, but also in the whisper of the wind, in the faithfulness of strangers, and in the succession that has yet to be revealed. He was no longer walking alone. He was no longer on the edge of the abyss. God was still working, even when he couldn't see it. And Elijah, with his faith renewed, descended from the mountain, ready to anoint kings and call his successor. Elijah descended from Mount Horeb not as a fugitive, but as an envoy. Although Jezebel's threat still loomed, the divine instruction had reoriented him. His heart, once worn down by the struggle, now beat with purpose. God had given him a new task, and part of it involved finding the one who would be his successor, Elisha. He crossed the regions of Judah and headed north until he reached Abel-Meholah, a fertile land where the waters of the Jordan nourished the fields. There he found Elisha, son of Shaphat, working the land. He wasn't praying or waiting for a sign, but faithfully carrying out his daily labor. He was guiding the last of 12 yoke of oxen, a sign that he was a man of means, but also of humility. Elijah approached without saying a word. He made no speeches, no proclamations. He took off his cloak, the same one that had covered his face on Horeb, the symbol of his prophetic calling, and threw it over Elisha. It was a silent gesture, but one packed with meaning. This was no mere cloak. It was a calling, an invitation to leave everything behind and follow a life of obedience and service to God. Elisha stopped immediately. He understood the gesture. No explanation was needed. He ran after Elijah and said, "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I will come with you." Elijah replied, "Go back. What have I done to you?" It wasn't a rebuke, but an affirmation that the choice had to be his. Elijah was not compelling him. The call had to be freely answered. Elisha went back, but not to reconsider. He went back to say farewell, like someone burning their bridges behind them. He took his yoke of oxen, sacrificed them, and using the plough and yokes as fuel, he cooked the meat and gave it to the people to eat. It was a deeply symbolic act. His old life was over. There would be no turning back. Then he got up, followed Elijah, and became his servant, not as an equal, but as a disciple, an apprentice. Elijah, for his part, found comfort in the companionship. For years he had walked alone, carrying the weight of God's word on his shoulders. Now he had someone who would walk with him, who would learn, who would eventually continue the work. Elisha was not just a helper. He was a living sign that God's purpose extended beyond a single generation. Time passed, and Elisha accompanied Elijah through the cities and roads of the kingdom. He listened to his words, observed his actions, and learned his character. There was a deep readiness in him, a surrender without reservation. While divine judgment continued to fall upon the unfaithful kingdoms, God was working in secret, shaping the new prophet in the silence of service. Meanwhile, Elijah also fulfilled his other instructions, anointing Hazael as the future king of Aram, and Jehu as an instrument of judgment on the house of Ahab. Elijah would not live to see all the consequences of these actions, but he knew that history did not depend on his presence, but on God's plan. He had understood that being God's instrument doesn't always mean seeing the fruits of your labor, but rather obeying with faithfulness. And now, with Elisha by his side, he knew the torch would not be extinguished, that the word would continue to run its course. Elijah's work was not yet finished. One final stage awaited him. It would not be a common death. His destiny, already marked from the beginning, would soon be revealed in a supernatural way, and Elisha would be there to witness it. Elijah's time on earth was drawing to a close, but it would not be an ordinary farewell. He would not know death as most men do. God had prepared something different, something that would forever mark the memory of his disciple and confirm the greatness of the purpose that had sustained him from the very beginning. Elijah knew it. Elisha sensed it too. The two were walking together from Gilgal when Elijah said to his disciple, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha replied with steadfastness, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." Together they went down to Bethel. There, the company of the prophets, those apprentices who lived in community, came out to meet them. One of them took Elisha aside and said, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," Elisha replied. "Be quiet." It was a sacred day, a moment that didn't need to be announced with words, but lived with reverence. Elijah spoke again. "Stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho." But Elisha repeated his vow of loyalty. He would not leave him. In Jericho, the company of prophets also knew what was about to happen. Elijah was more than a man. He was a chosen servant, and his departure was part of the divine plan. Finally, Elijah said to him, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan." And once more, Elisha refused to leave his side. They both arrived at the banks of the river. 50 men from the company of the prophets followed them from a distance, watching in silence. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up and struck the water. Then the Jordan River parted to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground, just as the ancient Hebrews had done when entering the promised land. On the other side of the river, as the wind blew and the sun set on the horizon, Elijah turned to his disciple. "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Elisha did not hesitate. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," he requested. It was a profound petition, not for power, but for responsibility. Elisha wasn't asking for glory. He was asking for the capacity to continue the work, to carry the burden that Elijah was about to leave behind. Elijah looked at him seriously. "You have asked a difficult thing. Yet, if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." And as they were walking along and talking, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them. And Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. He was not consumed by the fire. He was taken up, glorified, before his disciples' very eyes. Elisha cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel!" And he saw him no more. He tore his own clothes as a sign of mourning, but also of transition. He went over to the cloak that had fallen from Elijah, and he picked it up. It was his now. He returned to the Jordan, stood before the water, and struck it with the cloak. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" And the waters parted. The sons of the prophets, seeing it from a distance, said, "The spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha." Thus began the ministry of the new prophet. But Elijah was not forgotten. Centuries later, he was still spoken of. His figure became a symbol of prophetic faithfulness, of God's power, of the fire that purifies, and of the heaven that calls. This was the story of Elijah, the man who walked with God, defied kings, heard his voice in the silence, and never knew death. If you want to continue exploring the lives of these incredible figures, check out our playlist on the prophets right here.